This conference will now be recorded.
Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Greetings, everyone. Another session of Connect the Dots. This is going to be quite an interesting one. I'm only going to be able to use a percentage of the verses that speak about this subject of what I'm calling the set time, God's calendar, God's time clock, because there are so many verses that I'll give enough, certainly, probably more than you might if you did this. But there's an overwhelming number of verses in the Bible that talks about God's predetermined times. He has a schedule of events, large and small, but he also has those events on a time schedule, a timeline. And some of those he kind of gives us clues and lets us know where along that timeline these events are going to happen. But other times he kind of leaves it a bit of a mystery to let us know that we need to continually look to him. Some of these will be revealed as we need to know them as they unfold. So God has events in a time order of those events. And the verse I'd like to start with, even though it's kind of in the middle of where it belongs in the Bible, but then we'll use it to go back and start from the beginning. And that's Psalm 102 in verse 12, because I think this kind of gives the idea of it. Psalm 102:13, excuse me. You will arise and have mercy on Zion, for the time to favor her, yes, the set time has come. And of course, Zion takes on a lot of depth of meaning in the Bible, a lot of dimension to it. Certainly, it refers to a particular place, Mount Zion. Then it expands to the idea of the temple and Jerusalem in general, and then the nation of Israel. And then it also includes the people of God today, the church saints. And so there's just a lot of depth to it, a lot of variety of application. But Zion is a real key word in the Bible for you to study out. But this idea of a set time, and this English word set time is from that very important and famous Hebrew word moedim. And moedim is used over 200 times in the Old Testament. And it speaks about a set time, appointed times, is how many like to say it. Some like to call it dress rehearsal, because a lot of these, especially involving the holy feast days, actually have a very prophetic nature to them that will be expanded on during the millennial. And so this is a real rich idea of this set time. And there'll be different words or phrases or terms used for this idea. And that's why I have said in these sessions, I'm not just looking at exact particular phrases or words and carry them through the Bible, but also ideas that may use slightly different terminology, but is speaking about the same thing. And Moedim is a word that kind of captures this idea. I would encourage you to study that more thoroughly. Just get out your Strong's Concordance or whatever uh, Greek help you use to look up Greek and Hebrew, in this case, words. Uh, and it will help you greatly. It's Strong's number 4150, if you want to use that. There are other good um, Hebrew help books that you can use. So this idea of Moedim, or this set time, it really goes all the way back to the very first chapter of the Bible, uh, the original creation. And when he said in verse 14 about the fourth day, Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons." And that word seasons is the word moedim. So it's not just about seasons like we think of the four seasons, but it's about seasons of God's events on a time clock that are also involved as it develops through the Old Testament, and for days and years. So it's not just about time on a calendar or time on a clock, but time on a prophetic clock that God has set. So that's kind of the beginning of the idea. And then it really becomes developed in the holy feast days when God gave the instructions to Moses at Sinai and he gave them to the people. And these are found in several different places, but Leviticus 23 is a good place for the what I call 7 plus 1 equals 8, which is a real important principle in the Bible. He gives the 7 annual holy feast days, but he begins by talking about the weekly Sabbath. So there's just a lot built into the holy feast days that involve this 7 plus 1 equals 8, because they involve that idea. The spring feast of Passover and first fruits and unleavened bread are a 7 plus 1 equals 8, or in this case, 1 plus 7, because Passover is a separate day, and then there's 7 days of unleavened bread. In Pentecost, it involves this also because it's 7 times 7 Sabbaths plus 1, which is the 50th. And then in the fall feast, you have, of course, trumpets and Day of Atonement and tabernacles. And then the holy feast days themselves end with this principle. There are 7 days of tabernacles. And then the 8th day, that great day of the feast, as it's called in John, is a day of coming out of your temporary dwelling and celebrating and feasting. And so it's interesting that God wants his holy feast days to begin with a feast, Passover, and end with a feast, the 8th day of Tabernacles, and of celebration, beginning with kind of a solemn day with Passover, and then a rejoicing day of the 8th day of Tabernacles, which is what we are to do in the Lord's Supper. Both, I call it a solemn joy feast. It's to have elements of both Passover and the 8th day of Tabernacles when we think about the fullness of what Christ did. And then in Leviticus 25, you start adding the Sabbath year, and then you add in the year of Jubilee. And of course, those are based on sevens, and Jubilee is based on 7 plus 1 equals 8. 7 Sabbath years, 49 years, and then the Jubilee year. So I would encourage you to study that principle also, because all of these speak about God's timetable, the set time. All 7 feasts and the Sabbath, weekly Sabbath as well, are to be accomplished or observed on particular times that God set. 5 of them are a date on the calendar, a particular day of a particular month. So they knew exactly when to observe these 5, and therefore those 5 can be on a different day of the week each year because they're a date on the calendar. But then 2 of them, being first fruits and Pentecost, they are always on the same day of the week, which is a Sunday, because both of them are said to be, if you study them out in Leviticus, the day after the Sabbath. It'd be a Sunday, we call it, the first day of the week. And so I like to point this out because, people that say Sunday is the wrong day of worshiping God, it's the worship of the sun, It's a false, invented idea by man. Yet, if you really think about it, with the 7 feast days, 2 of the 7 are always on a Sunday, and 5 of the 7, being a date on the calendar, are sometimes on a Sunday. So a strong argument could be made that actually Sunday is the prime day for the holy feast days set by God Himself. So to argue against meeting or worshiping God in an official way on Sunday is an invention by man. You're going to have to argue with God because He highlighted what we call Sunday, the first day of the week, in His holy feast days. So that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the Bible. But we have to go backwards just a little bit to pick up some particular things that involve a set time by God. For instance, in Genesis 17 and 21, the promise of the birth of Isaac, He said, but my covenant is opposed to Ishmael, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. The birth of Isaac was at a set time that God determined, and God brought it about because they were 2 dead bodies. She was barren and then past the age, and he was old. And Hebrews 11 talks about as good as dead, they brought forth life, which is a principle of the resurrection, of course, one of the ways Abraham came to understand the resurrection of the dead. But it took God intervening in order to bring about the birth of Isaac, and He did it at a particular time so that the birth would be at a particular time, known only to God. He didn't reveal to Abraham or Sarah. Of course, once she became pregnant, she could kind of figure it out closely, but that was all set by God. And then we go to the story of the Exodus and the Passover lamb and that whole wonderful story. In Exodus 13 and verse 10, uh, it says, you shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. So that just kind of reinforces what I said about the holy feast days. That God decided, He told Moses in the first month on the 14th day, and that was not to be changed. Exodus 28 and 43. I wanted to read this one because it's an example of how Moedim is sometimes translated gathering or congregation, because the extension of the idea of a set time, like the set holy feast, required a gathering of the people. And so the result of the set day was the people gathered together. So sometimes it's translated that way because they came together for a particular feast on a particular day. So Exodus 28:43, they shall be on Aaron and on his sons when they come into the tabernacle of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister the holy place, that they do not incur iniquity and die. That idea of meeting, tabernacle of meeting, and it's involved in the holy feast days. Uh, and it talks about the purposes. I won't get into that now. And then we get into, maybe we would go to Daniel, because the book of Daniel speaks about that idea quite a lot. The book of Daniel, chapter 8 and verse 19. And he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. So this builds through the centuries to its final conclusion in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, and the abomination of desolation and the revealing of the man of sin for who he really is. And so it's called the latter time of the indignation. And then ends up by saying, "For at the appointed time, the end shall be." The appointed time. In Daniel 9:27, that famous prophecy of the 70 weeks. And in this case, it doesn't say appointed time. It says at the end of course, all 70 of those periods of 7 years are appointed times. There is a beginning to it. There are three parts to it. There is a conclusion to it. And it says in verse 26 regarding the 69th week, and then afterwards, until the end of the war, desolations are determined. And then you go down to verse 27, the end of it, even until the consummation which is determined. So, this idea of determined time, it's a determined event at a determined time. And then chapter 12 kind of concludes all of this idea by talking about determined times with the famous, instead of 3.5 exactly, 1260 days, it includes these 1290 days and 1335. And it says, "But you go your way till the end." And that end is a determined time. "For you shall rest and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days," which we know to be the resurrection time and the return of Christ. So we're kind of establishing this idea all the way through. The 70 weeks themselves, of course, are 70 Sabbath years. They had violated 70 Sabbath years in their history for a period of 490 years, which goes back to the time they demanded a king. And God warned them through Samuel what that would involve. Part of what it involved in their minds is that they felt like they could no longer let the land rest every 7 years, because now you have a palace, you have all kinds of palace people, you have all kinds of armies, you have all kinds of dignitaries visiting from other countries. And the king was going to require a lot of your food, a lot of your crops, a lot of your sheep and cattle. And so they felt like they needed to quit observing the Sabbath year because of the extra requirement, which shows, of course, a lack of faith on their part to trust God to provide. Maybe we'll move to the Old Testament now. There are quite a bit more. I did want to read Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, however you want to pronounce it, because this was one of my text verses that I used in the 3 years I did the end times on Tuesday nights and recorded them and put them up on YouTube for you to look at. And Habakkuk lived during the time leading up to the Babylonian captivity. So he was seeing some of the worst of it, along with Jeremiah, along with Zephaniah, even young Daniel. And Josiah died just before the worst of it. But in Habakkuk 2 and verse 2, I love these verses 2 and 3. "Then the Lord answered me and said, Write the vision, make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time." That's the word Moedim again. And then he talks about the certainty of it. "But at the end it will speak, and it will not lie, though it tarries." And it has, hasn't it? "Wait for it in patient faith, because it will surely come." There's a certainty of it because God is sovereign. God's not going to let anything stop his events on a timeline. He knows how to overcome evil. He knows how to get around all the efforts of Satan and his seed. And he says, "Because it will surely come, it will not tarry." So there's going to be a certain point, as Jesus talked about often, that then the end will come. Now, when we move over into the New Testament, maybe we'll look at Romans chapter 5. Try to do this in a little bit of time order, even though the events may not be in this exact order. But in Romans chapter 5, in verse 6, there's this little phrase that's used a number of times in the New Testament, in due time. And, in English, in due time kind of has variableness to it. But really, the idea is at the right time. And the right time is God's exact time, the appointed time of God. So it says in Romans 5:6, for when we were still or yet without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. And so we say that in due time is much more specific, let's say, than some general statement about eventually it'll happen, because we know Christ died at the exact day of the exact month, at the exact hour, at the exact minute that God had predetermined. And of course, that was regarding the timing of the Passover and the time of day of the daily sacrifices, beginning and ending of his time on the cross. You look at the day that Christ died in connection to the feast days, especially Passover, and the timing of everything on that day, it becomes something very beautiful, and it lets us know how precise God is, that he can bring about such a major event that had to include the Jewish leaders, had to include the Roman government, had to include many people and many events connected to it for that to come about. And that's why many times in the Gospels it talks about they tried to capture him, they tried to kill him, they tried to throw him in prison, but they could not, because it says so clearly, because his time was not yet. Well, we think, that just means general time. No, his specific time to allow it to happen was not there yet. But when that exact time came about, he knew exactly that when he had to go to Jerusalem for that last week, the events that he had to take care of leading up to his arrest and death. So even though a lot was packed into those last several days after his triumphal entry leading up to his arrest and death, it was very orderly. He knew exactly what needed to happen next. He knew what needed to happen within those few days. He made sure they all were accomplished. And, he told his disciples, my time has come. Let's go to Jerusalem. So he understood the timing on the clock of his Father, and he submitted to it. And we, of course, are the ones blessed by it. And then we go to Galatians 4:4, which is a little bit out of time order of what it speaks about. He says in verse 2 about the heir in verse 1 does not differ from a slave, though he is master of all, but is under guardians and stewards until the time appointed by the Father. So even in Jewish custom and life, there was a time order of when a young man would become a man, or would be looked at in a different way than as a young child. A particular time, and they all knew when it was, and they would set up a big day and a feast and celebration and invite people because they knew that the time had come. So he enlarges on that regarding the birth of Christ. It says in verse 4, but when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. The fullness of what time? Well, we might say the fullness of the near end to the 69th week of Daniel's 70th week. They knew that prophecy. They had a better understanding than we do of the start of that, the outworking of that, because the Gospel of Luke talks about during the days of John the Baptist, they were all in anticipation. They were all in expectation. There was a certain feeling or understanding, whether they connected it to Daniel's 70 weeks, and that after the 69th week, the Messiah would be cut off, as Isaiah 53 calls it, from the land of the living, his death. But there was enough knowledge about it, and there was enough discussion and sharing of different ideas that there was an air of expectation, so that the people wondered, is John the Baptist the Christ, the Messiah? Or should we look for another, as they later asked? Why was this air of expectation, anticipation? Because Jewish people were very good with genealogies, and genealogies involve times, lives, years, set times. And so they had within them this instinct, if maybe even more than that, direct knowledge based on their prophets that something big was about to happen regarding the Messiah on the time clock of Daniel's 70 weeks. And so when the fullness of the time had come on God's time clock, God, through the Holy Spirit, came to the Virgin Mary and started the pregnancy process at exactly the right time, so that his birth would be at the right time, so that he could come out publicly around his 30th birthday and his baptism, so that he could then know from that the time of his death. And he knew when he started his ministry at what particular Passover day on what particular year, that a few days before that, whatever he was doing, he needed to pack up, take his disciples to Jerusalem, because there was an appointed time, a Moedim, set by the Father for him. Then we'll also look at 2 Thessalonians 2:6, because this is kind of an interesting contrast regarding the false Christ, the Antichrist. It says in Paul, that wonderful chapter about the parousia, the coming of Christ and our gathering together to him, so our resurrection or rapture. And then he starts laying out what must happen first. Two of the things that must happen first are the two events of verse 3. That in God's time clock, not because Satan is more powerful than God, not because Antichrist is more powerful than Christ, but because God set it that way. The appointed time of the two events of verse 3, the apostasy and the revealing of the man of sin, must come first, that verse says, before the two events of verse 3. So even though the return of Christ and our gathering to him is at an appointed time that the Father knows and set, he appointed an appointed time that two other things must happen about 3.5 years, or maybe in his mind exactly, he knows the exact days of all of it, that the two events of verse 3 might happen. And so it says in verse 6, and now you know what is restraining, that he, the Antichrist, may be revealed in his own time. But it's not a time that he decided. It's a time that God decided. And so God is allowing all this to work out. It's amazing how that the evil plans of the Antichrist and then of his father Satan and all that will be involved in that last 3.5 years, they will think they're in control of all of it. But God has already worked out the timing of it all, and it's being worked out on God's timetable. So I think I'll stop with this instead of, there's a number of other verses in the Old and New Testament that we could read regarding this idea of the set time. But I've given you enough. You can build on it. And I guess one reason to understand this subject as deeply as you can is it gives you an appreciation. We stand in awe of a God who has an end purpose in mind. And in order for that end purpose to be realized, many, many events must take place leading up to it. And he has them all on a timeline. And it just gives us a deeper respect, a love for a God that is able to do this and has decided to do this. And he just wants us to align ourselves in humble faith to what he has already decided to do and when to do it. So may God bless you. And I hope that something was said along the line that opened up some light bulbs in your thinking and has encouraged you to study this subject even further. So this is session number 10 of Connect the Dots.